Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Scripture in Black and White. We're so thrilled that you have been following us and listening to each episode in this season. This season, we've been dealing with the family, marriage, parenting, and so many issues that relate to that. And today we have another special guest, and I'm going to give way to our co-host and friend, Bobby Harrington, to introduce our special guest. Bobby, good to see you again.
Great to see you, Anthony. I'm very excited about this interview because we get to interview Nancy Peercy. And for many years, I have been a long distance fan of her work. For everybody who's joining with us, let me tell you a little bit about Professor Peercy. So, Nancy Peercy, or we would say if we were with her in an academic setting, Professor Peercy is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as a book that a lot of people have said good things about, Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, one of my favorite titles, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth and Total Truth. She is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's been quoted in The New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. That's a pretty impressive introduction, but I would just say this to all of our fans and followers of Scripture in Black and White. She loves Jesus, and she's trying her best to follow Jesus and help everybody to make sure that we have intellectual integrity as we follow and honor Jesus. So, Nancy, welcome. I'm going to start us off by just jumping right in. Your book on toxic masculinity is, in my opinion, a super important book that's come out. I've read the book myself. I'm so glad for the message. And let me just say this before I ask you my question. In this podcast, Anthony and I spent some time looking at the text of the New Testament, which clearly teaches that the husband is to be a Christlike head in his family. The word head communicates not just servant leadership, but there's a certain, authority and responsibility that comes with it to be like Jesus, really, with our wives and to lead like Jesus with our families. And a lot of people have a problem with that. So let's start with the good news. People often accuse evangelical Christian men of being oppressive patriarchs, prone to abuse, misogyny, but you make the surprising claim that they test out as having the lowest levels of abuse and divorce, and these are my words, actually being some of the best possible husbands and fathers. Please explain.
Yeah, well, your words are exactly right. So this was actually the reason I finally decided to write this book, right? This was kind of the final trigger, is I started reading sociological studies of Christian men, and I was just taken aback. That was so different from everything we'd ever heard in the secular media, the mainstream narrative, which is, of course, like you said, the idea that evangelical men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity. And I'll give you just one quote. It was easy to find them with a Google search, but here's one. This was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which came after the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating Christianity today. And so what happened is the social scientists, the psychologists, sociologists, were looking at these accusations and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, where's your data? And so they went and did the studies, and I quote some dozen or so studies that all found that evangelical Christian men actually do test out at the top as the best, most loving, most engaged husbands and fathers. Their wives report the highest level of happiness with their husband's love and affection. And by the way, I sometimes get pushback on that. So yes, the wives were interviewed separately, which can be important. Evangelical husbands test out as the most engaged fathers, 3.5 hours more with their children than secular men, both in shared activities like sports and church youth group and in church of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples divorce at the lowest rate of any other group in America, 35% less than secular men. And the real surprise, they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. So I was so surprised by this. Let me give you a quote. Sometimes a quote can really summarize it for you. I'm going to give this quote from the New York Times. This is I call him my go-to sociologist because he did the largest study. And his name is Brad Wilcox. He's at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature in the field, he does get published in places like the New York Times. And so this is what he said there. It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Of course, these studies often focus on the wives because the assumption is that these abusive husbands, are domineering and controlling the wives. But no, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his colleagues. I don't know if you know, but sociology is a very secular discipline. So these are mostly secular people. He turns to them and says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So the bottom line is, the churches don't know this, and certainly the public doesn't know this, but this is not a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings that Christianity does have the power to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in the subtitle of my book.
Wow, thank you for that. That's interesting, eye-opening for me. I want to go back to one of the things you were talking about, because oftentimes we hear, especially in the world today, which is kind of hostile towards marriage and the old concept of marriage. And so one of the issues that people will say is, oh, well, Christians, they divorce just like the rest of society. So what's the use in being? How do you respond to that?
It is the first pushback I always get, right? And in fact, in my research, I discovered that it is one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. So the researchers went back to the data and they made a very crucial distinction between men who are really committed Christians and attend church regularly and really living it out from nominal Christians. And so nominal would be men who claim an evangelical identity, but nominal, my students don't even know what the word means, so I have to tell them. NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only. Right. And these are men who, on a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example, but who attend church rarely, if at all. It's more of a cultural background, family background. And these men test out shockingly different. And this is a lot of the reason for the negative stereotype. They actually, their wives test out as the least happy in their marriage. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular men. And the real shocker, they have the highest rate of domestic violence of any major group in America. So any study of evangelicals, as a whole, is going to give you misleading numbers because you've got men who are better than secular men, and then you have men who are worse than secular men. And that's why the numbers have been so skewed. That's why most of us don't know this. And I think I would like this to get into the churches first, because even Christian men feel beaten down by charges of toxic masculinity. When I told my class at Houston Christian University that I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Okay, Even in Christian circles, they need this message. And then, of course, in secular, in the secular realm, in public, it's a great apologetic in terms of helping people to see that the secular narrative is completely wrong, and they're getting it wrong though because of this misunderstanding of these two very different groups.
That's great. Nancy, can you just clarify for our audience, because this really stood out strongly to me? You're saying that when it comes to committed evangelical husbands, how they're so different than those who say they're evangelical, but they're just nominal, or we would call them cultural Christians. They just attend church the odd time. That second group, that nominal cultural Christian group, is pretty bad according to your study. Like atheistic men are better.
That's exactly right. I sometimes get people asking me, why would they be even worse than secular men? And apparently it's because, they feel religious justification for it. They take words like headship and submission, but they don't give it biblical meaning. They import meaning from the secular script for masculinity of entitlement, dominant, control, and so on. But because they have religious language, they feel religious justification. So the average secular guy who may be hitting his wife and kids doesn't feel any religious justification for it. But the nominal Christian man does, and so as he's getting he's getting the worst of both worlds, so that he ends up actually testing out as worse than the atheist or the secular man, the man with no religious affiliation, as the sociologist put it.
Mm.
And it does say, by the way, it does suggest too the challenge to the church. On the one hand, can the church do a better job of supporting the men who are doing well? Right? I have a graduate student who's the head of a women's ministry in a large Baptist church here in Houston, and she said, on Mother's Day we hand out roses and tell the mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so I think it's time to stop scolding the men, and bring this data into the church to help, support and encourage Christian men who are doing a good job. It also suggests, however, that the church has a responsibility to reach out to these nominal men. And can we figure out a better way to disciple them? Because they are out there publicly presenting, as evangelicals, and ruining the reputation of evangelicals, I might say.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
how does the church bring them in and disciple them? We now know what our job is in the church in relation to these two groups of men.
Yeah. So, when we look at, all these issues that you're bringing up that are facing men in general, and even how you've broken it down as far as those who are committed Christians, those who are nominal, and those who are secular, across the board, they're going to be men of all backgrounds that are going to read your book. Men are typically falling behind in areas of education, of health, of life expectancy. Why would you say that we're not really paying attention to the real issues that men are facing?
Yes, I was pretty struck by how much men and boys are falling behind. Boys are falling behind from the age of kindergarten. They don't have the same fine motor control to operate a scissors. And so
Mm,
already in kindergarten, they're feeling like, I'm worse than the girls. One psychotherapist who wrote a book on the subject said, in the schools, boys are treated as defective girls. Um, and, and so boys are falling behind all the way through school. Boys are falling behind in university. The average university now is 60% female, 40% male. And in some smaller colleges, it's worse. When I started teaching here at Houston Christian University, we was 70-30, 70% female. And we've been
mm,
working to fix that. They fixed it by starting a football team and starting an engineering department to attract more male students.
Wow.
Um, Graduate school, too. More women than men are going to graduate school and professional schools like law and medicine. And then after school, You were exactly right. Men are falling behind both relative to women and relative to where men used to be in terms of homelessness, mental illness, drug and alcohol addiction, prison. 90%, 95% of people in prison are male. And recently there has been some studies done on male unemployment. It's not showing up in the normal unemployment statistics because they stopped looking for work, and so they had to dig deeper. And the researchers are telling us now that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels. That was shocking.
Wow.
I mean, we think of the
Mm.
Great Depression, right, as this time of incredible poverty. Male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels, and you just mentioned life expectancy. So in recent
Hmm.
years, male life expectancy has gone down, and the significant thing is women's is not. So it's not a general trend; it's just men. And one science magazine called The New Scientist put it this way: the major demographic factor now in early death is being male. So I do think it's time for us to say, isn't it time to have compassion on men and start asking what are they facing? And the first book on the subject really was it's called The War Against Boys by a philosopher named Christina Hoff Sommers, and she said every time we tried to have some program that would help boys, the feminist organizations would shoot it down. And they would say, well, men end up, at the top of the ladder anyway, eventually. But what they ignored is that on average, males males life expectancy and success and education is all going down. On average, it's actually gone down, and that's what we need to pay attention to. And I have a little glimmer of hope because people are finally starting to acknowledge it. There was a recent book out by a researcher from the Brookings Institution called Of Men and Boys, not a Christian book. But the first time somebody from a sort of centrist, maybe a little bit left of center think tank was writing a, a book that was sympathetic to men and boys, and not from a Christian perspective. And the Washington Post recently had an article. It was written by a black woman, which was an interesting perspective. Christine Emba, if you want to look it up, EMBA, Christine Emba, and it was called "Men Are Lost." They got more reader mail from that article than anything they'd had in years. They had to cut off the comments finally because it was, after it was 10,000 something,
Wow.
So I thought that was pretty cool. Those are both very recent, but it might show a glimmer of people starting to recognize it's time to start saying, how can we help men and boys?
So, Nancy, let me jump in there on that because one of the things that we find at Renew Network and really in a lot of evangelical churches, and this is often propagated by well known scholars, is that the churches are patriarchal, which is bad. And because they're patriarchal, they're misogynistic. And there's so much pressure right now for churches to cave. And what we find is that just the air we breathe has this message of we've all got to focus on the empowerment of women. I don't know if you saw the movie Barbie. I actually saw the movie Barbie last week,
Did you?
and it was interesting to me, but sad because, in Barbie land, all the women, they're dominant and they rule, and then they leave Barbie Land and go to the real world. And the word or the impression is in the real world, patriarchy dominates, and that's terrible for women. And so Ken comes back and he's trying to change Barbie Land, but they revolt and he's not able to change it. And like if I was a young man watching that movie, it'd be like I'd be so confused about myself. And then other examples. Just recently, we like my wife and I like to watch spy type movies and things like that. And so you have this new series out called Lioness, which is like dominant women in the U.S. military, special ops, and all that. And it's kind of like everybody's beating the drum, more women power, less men. And so many young men are just lost. And I just want to ask you for practical advice in that cultural climate of how church leaders can disciple not just the young men, but the young women into this, what is actually human flourishing that you've discovered.
Yeah, well, writing a book like this, of course, one of the first questions people ask is, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women? And so I have to put that right at the beginning of the book. And let's start with just basic biology. Men are bigger, stronger, faster, 90% greater upper body muscle strength. Um, because of testosterone, they are more aggressive and more risk taking. And this is just their starting material. This is clearly God's design. Right? We're not talking about sin that happens after the fall. This is how God designed men. And so we have to start by just affirming that these are good things and that our culture should be thankful for what men
Mm,
bring. There was a study done on men around the world. This first ever study done, cross-cultural study on concepts of masculinity, and done by an anthropologist. He's not a Christian. But what he found is, cultures are a little different in how they define masculinity, but he found a common thread that in all cultures around the world, they agree that the good man will perform what he calls the three P's: provide, protect, and procreate. Become a father, build into the next generation, have a family. And these were not countries with a Christian background. This seems to be universal. That, well, as we would say, men are made in God's image, right? And they do know that their unique masculine strength was not given them to get what they want and to dominate over others, but it was given them to protect, provide for, care for, and if necessary, fight for those that they love. And I thought that was very encouraging because it implies that this is an innate, inherent knowledge that men have. We might call it general revelation, right? General revelation is what we know just from creation, and special
hmm
revelation is what we know from the Bible. So
hmm
this is general revelation that men do seem to know, either at a basic level, what it means to be a good man and how to use their strengths to take care of and provide for those they love. And I think that, uh, um, by the way, this might also be Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. um, I think that this is something that will give us a much better way to approach these issues because men don't respond well to being called toxic, right? I mean, who would? So instead,
Right.
can we can we tap into that innate, inherent knowledge of what it means to be a good man and encourage, support, affirm men in that inherent knowledge, which they seem to have just because they're made in God's image. That gives a much more positive way to approach these issues.
So, so in your book, you mentioned that the criticisms of men begin earlier than most people think. Is that what you would suggest the idea of toxic masculinity comes from?
Yeah, most people probably think it came out of 1960s second wave feminism. No, no, it came out much earlier. If you read the literature from the historians, they will tell you it starts with the Industrial Revolution. I read several books on the history of masculinity. I mean, I say several. There are whole libraries of books on women's history because of the feminist movement. There are very few on men's history. So I got to read them all. But it was cool because then I was getting history from a masculine perspective. Um, Before the Industrial Revolution, men worked alongside their wives and children all day, right? It was on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men was much more focused on their caretaking role, on their responsibility for the well-being of the family. In fact, back then they used to say you were not supposed to only be the father of your family, but they used the term father of the community. You're supposed to bring that caretaking ethos out into the community. Um, and here was a surprising fact: the literature on childbearing back then was addressed to fathers. not mothers. Like if you go to a bookstore today, they're almost all mothers. Back
Mm-hmm.
then,
Mm-hmm.
it was fathers, right? Because fathers were considered the primary parent. And so, how did we lose all that? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home, and men had to follow their work out of the home. And they were no longer working with their family members, right? People they loved and had a moral bond with. And so instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And already in the 19th century, you see people start to protest that men were losing their caretaking ethos that they had had, that they were becoming individualistic, egocentric, self centered, greedy, and acquisitive. I'm using their language, and even turning their work into an idol. They were becoming more secular in their outlook. They were beginning to turn their job, into their into their religion, and they used that word idol. That men of that time were turning their career into an idol, and so that is when you first start to see negative language applied to the male character. And so, what I suggest that if that's when it started, that does suggest the solution too, which is, are there ways, in other practical ways today that we can reconnect fathers with their families, even though they still work out of the home? Can we tweak the workplace at all? I have a whole chapter on it. You can't talk about this without some solutions. I do have a whole chapter on just giving anecdotes of men who found ways to, especially after the pandemic, it's become easier, but men who found ways to work 2 days a week from home, or even leave early. I had a graduate student who left work early 2 days a week so he could coach his son's basketball and soccer teams. And his boss accused him of coasting. Um, but he said it did not ultimately hurt my career. And when my sons grew up, they said, "We want to be a father like you," which is a lot better than any workplace accolades. So I have a chapter on that, and the pandemic really did help. The New York Times just recently had an article titled "During the Pandemic, Fathers Got Closer to Their Children, and They Don't Want to Lose That." And so it has opened
Mm.
up. It's been a game changer. Where I even I quote some CEOs too, because you've got to persuade corporations, right, that this is good for them. And I quote the CEO who said, prior to the pandemic, we were very hostile to the idea of remote work because we thought people would slough off, right? They wouldn't get their work done. And he said, the pandemic completely exploded that fear. That you give parents time to be better parents, they are actually better workers as well. And so I give one anecdote. Sometimes an anecdote will kind of crystallize it. So this is one of my graduate students. Her husband came home during the pandemic, and because he was home, he was able to be more involved with the family's homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch for the family every day. He could take his kids to soccer and choir practice. And he took up so many of the family responsibilities that his wife started a part-time business. my my graduate student was an opera singer, which is kind of a unique. But she started a voice studio, and the whole family benefited from the additional income. So I interviewed her husband for the book, and he said, "Our life is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle." And then the final kicker was, he said to me, "The time that I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying every morning with my wife."
Mm.
So I thought, okay, stories like that, we need to get those out to encourage men to think creatively about, ways we might be able to tweak the workplace to have
Bobby,
greater,
let me ask the quick follow up real quickly. So you mentioned about some of these tweaks. I could assume that there's going to be the criticism of, well, now that is a feminization of the workplace, that we have to kind of soften it because the man is, to be the macho, the oh. How do you respond to that one?
oh, feminization of the workplace. That critique is raised when people want to bring childcare to the workplace, and
Mm,
I'm not saying bring childcare to the workplace. I'm saying bring
right.
the father home. you know, so that it's a
Gotcha.
different dynamic. I'm saying let fathers work more from home, and
Gotcha.
I give lots of anecdotes of men who he they sometimes paid quite a price You know, they were willing to pay the daddy penalty of,
Mm.
maybe they didn't get as many raises, they didn't advance quite as quickly, or they even went full bore and started a home-based business. Um, and I have some ones you might not expect. Most people think, oh yeah, that you could do that with with white collar workers. But one of the people I interviewed was a jewelry maker. That's not something you think of.
Yeah.
um, and some people say, well, you're talking about, again, people. What about blue collar workers? Well, I have a good friend who runs an auto repair shop. Now, generally, he doesn't take his cars home to his living room. But he could bring his paperwork home, and he does. What he does is he brings all his paperwork home, and he sits at the dinner table, and his kids are sitting around him doing their homework. So he's interacting with them and answering their questions. And so the way I put it in the book is not every job can be done at home, but aspects of almost every job can be done at home, so that you can be recreate more of that, almost that colonial pattern where the father is working alongside his children. So he's able to do economically productive work while raising his kids. I think that's the goal.
Mm.
Those are great examples, Nancy. I want to ask you about a book that you actually wrote the foreword to that ties into this, and that is C.R. Wiley's The Household and the War for the Cosmos. And I think that the title of the book kind of describes, what you're talking about, the importance of this Christ-like head of the home. And he describes it as so important, it's involved in the war for the cosmos. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, the first time I ever met Chris Wiley, we found out we had a very common vision of the family, which was the Industrial Revolution did not only take work out of the home and men out of the home, but well, it took women's work out of the home as well, because a lot of manufacture back then was household manufacture. Women, cooked from scratch. they and they made clothes from scratch. From carding the wool to spinning it into thread to weaving it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
uh, they canned food. They made candles and buttons. I mean, everything, churned butter, what everything. And that was taken out of the home as well, which is a good part of the reason for the feminist movement, because women wanted to work too. I mean, the cultural mandate was given to both men and women. But once they did that, they said, oh, well, let's take education out too. Let's give that to the experts. Oh, let's take care of the sick and the elderly. Let's take that out and put them in nursing homes. And let's take, wow, even entertainment. How many people sit down with their family and play a game or read a book together? No, entertainment is we're all on our electronics. We're all being entertained by the outside world. So both Chris Wiley and I share the ideal that the only way we're going to restore the strength of the family is to restore some of the functions of the family. You see, by the 1950s, the sociologists were noticing that our families were becoming fragile because they no longer had anything to do together. I mean, they would come and sit in the living room and relate over what? Nothing. They had no common activities, no common functions, no common goals. They split for the whole day and came home at night for dinner. And it was about the 1950s, sociologists be trying, well, at first they tried to give it a positive spin. They said, oh, well, this is good because now it means that the family can focus on what it's best at with it, which is emotional relationships. But people don't have emotional relationships in a vacuum. You know, it's usually they're doing
Right.
something together, something of value, something that they both, you know, hold as a high goal. So I think that my goal is that we can maybe return to some degree the functions of the family. I think that's what homeschooling is all about, right? Homeschooling is probably the biggest one that people have said, it's been taken out of the hands of the family, and it's not been necessarily a good thing, especially now. Our public schools are so secularized. The secular worldview is being taught there is so dominant.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how any kid survives. So we're bringing homeschooling was the first thing I think people brought back. When they did that, though, a lot of women started doing home-based businesses. Do you know that? Oh, what was the number? About 2/3 of women do some kind of a home-based business already. they either have a part-time job that can be done at home while raising their kids, or they start businesses and so on. So 2/3 of women who are home are already restoring, work to the family as well, so that they are enjoying sort of that colonial integration of, you can raise your kids while doing economically productive work. Uh, Sometimes the family business becomes so successful that the fathers quit their jobs and join them, which I think is cool. Um, and Chris Wiley, of course, being a pastor, is also really, really big on bringing worship back to the family. Come on,
Yeah.
guys. Don't say you've done your job when you've dropped your kid off at youth group. No, it's your job as a parent. Family devotions, family prayer. You're the one who's in charge of your kids' spiritual well being and your wife's spiritual well being. So bringing family worship back might be the most important. That's kind of the heart of the family. But that's where I share a sort of restore the household model. I share that with
Yeah.
Chris Wiley in his book.
Awesome.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So listen, the long-term strategy of preventing, so they say, the toxic behavior in men is that fathers invest deeply in their sons. But if you look at any, television show, most movies and things, men are portrayed as just Neanderthals. We can barely figure out how to do anything. Where did that image, per your understanding, where did that image come from that we just, oh well.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on fatherhood because it is so important. I quote a psychiatrist who said, "We're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers." Because it is fathers primarily who train their kids in knowing what it means to be a man, a healthy, biblically oriented man. And 40% of American households are single parent households now. It's the highest in the world. Did you know that? We have the highest rate of
Wow.
single parenthood in the world. So, so part of it is, I think, because of what you just said. Our media portrays the father as the doofus dad, the
Hmm.
bumbling idiot. My son loved the Berenstain Bears, and the father was always the incompetent father. That goes back to the Industrial Revolution too. It's
Mm.
when the fathers were taken out of the home, they no longer had that really close, intimate, day-to-day relationship with their children, which meant they didn't really understand what their kids were going through anymore. They didn't know their thinking, their feelings. They were kind of out of touch with the family dynamics. And already in the 19th century, you see books starting to say, fathers have become kind of irrelevant. Fathers are becoming, insignificant and even incompetent. You actually see the language of incompetence already in the 19th century. And so once again, if you want to reverse, the trend was treating fathers as, incompetent idiots, you have to restore the father-son relationship so that fathers are once again respected, honored, and their contribution to the family is seen as unique. And one of the problems I often see is that people say, "Well, it's up to the mother to sort of train the father," as if he's sort of he's not naturally a good father. No, 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 no. God made men to be fathers. And I'm not averse to appealing to self-interest. I do have several studies that I cite on um, what men gain, how men benefit from becoming fathers. Because well, we always knew that women, when they give birth, they have oxytocin, the rise of a hormone, oxytocin, the bonding hormone, which gives them a little
Hmm.
biochemical boost, in bonding with their newborn baby. But it turns out that fathers also have oxytocin, a rise in oxytocin, which helps them bond with their baby. It's stimulated by the tactile sense. So they have to be actually holding, touching, cuddling their baby for it to really be stimulated. Um, but neurologists actually talk about, they call it the dad brain. There's a nest of neurons in your brain that are not activated unless you become a father. And so you actually experience brain growth when you become a father. And here's the final. This was the most recent finding. It was by an anthropologist. She wrote a book called The Life of Dad. And they found out that a man's oxytocin actually rising all through his wife's pregnancy. Apparently, nobody had thought to test a man's blood during his wife's pregnancy. But when they did,
Oh,
we
wow.
found that God is biochemically priming men to be engaged fathers all through the 9 months of pregnancy. So it is totally built into the masculine character to be loving, engaged fathers. And that men do find, I gave several quotes from men who said, the secular script is that men get their identity and fulfillment mostly from their job, and that their family is kind of secondary. And men, I quoted men saying that wasn't true. When I had my kids, I found out actually this is a much greater form of
Yeah.
fulfillment. They said I feel
Totally.
cheated. Some of them said I feel cheated that nobody told me. So I'm very happy to help men realize that they also benefit. So it's not just that scolding, like I mentioned earlier. The scolding men do better. No, get rid of the scolding. Let them know that they are actually going to benefit from becoming active fathers.
Bobby,
That's
did you hear that? Nancy just said, I have been getting smarter with my young kids. I have got a dad brain now that's even better.
Hey, I was trying to tell you, one of the things that we talked about in an earlier episode, Nancy, is I just shared the best thing in my life has been my kids. Like when I just talked about the sheer most enjoyable, when I say that, it's with my wife. It's been the happiest, most joyful part of my life has been doing that. So I have a question for you. I'm so encouraged by how you use the intellect that God gave you and just the a strong godly woman pursuing academic integrity and rigor and engaging in some of the discussions of the day. The editor we have at Renew, uh, Daniel McCoy, believes that the dominant philosophy in our day is intersectional feminism, which means that through our media and other places, everybody is being trained to think of intersectionality. In other words, there's always an oppressor and the oppressed, and especially women. And I wonder, Nancy, I guess this is kind of a hard question to ask. I was thinking about it, thought, how can I ask this question? But at the end of the day, I just, it's so important that we disciple the minds of people. And it is so difficult to get a fair hearing with many young people in their early 20s on these issues. I know you've done a lot of the battles on X, used to be called Twitter, with the intellectual debates and all that. But do you have any advice? First of all, is the assessment of intersectional feminism being such a dominant factor? Do you agree with that? And just on a briefly intellectual basis, any advice for those of us who are trying to influence churches in how to help people to think better about these things?
I think intersectional feminism is a subset of a larger philosophy. It's postmodernism. It's a form of postmodernism. But postmodernism, um, it actually, it goes back to Hegel. Hegel was a German thinker. If you've read Francis Schaeffer, he traces postmodernism back to Hegel. And when I was young, I wasn't sure he was right, but now he was right. But most people don't even know Hegel. I mean, you could get through a college course in philosophy and never study him. But he taught a kind of pantheism where God was a mind or spirit unfolding, evolving in and through the universe. And his was the first philosophy that suggested that truth itself is evolving. Because if the mind, if this divine mind is unfolding over time, then truth itself is evolving over time. And that's why Schaeffer focused on Hegel so much, because that's the kind of relativism that we face today. It's the idea that truth is constantly changing, but also that your tribe has its own truth. There's the intersectionality. For Hegel, every social group, race, ethnicity, sex, all the normal categories, has its own truth, because the absolute mind is unfolding, through each individual group, and so they have their own truth. And it's interesting, because what that means is the bigger question is actually kind of pantheism. It actually is a theology that's at the root of it. And it's given rise to the idea that each sort of, like I said, each group, race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of our groups now, that they each have their own truth. So in that sense, he's right. That's the intersectionality part. But it's much broader than just feminism. It's all of these groups are said to have their own truth. And uh, and how do you talk to young people about it? I would still probably go back to Love Thy Body. You've read Love Thy Body, right? Because Love Thy Body is able to show that issues like gender identity and homosexuality and abortion all rest on a denigration of the body. I mean, it's most obvious with transgenderism, right? Transgender activists say explicitly, my gender identity has nothing to do with my body. My biology, my biological identity has nothing to do with who I am. It has nothing to do with my authentic self. And so the denigration of the body is very obvious there. But I would say homosexuality too, because even my homosexual friends agree that on the level of biology, physiology, anatomy, chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. And that is how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. And so to embrace a same-sex identity is to counter that design, is to go against that design. It's to say, well, why should my body have any say in my moral choices? Why should my biology have anything to do with my sexual orientation? And so that is still the denigration of the body. It's still kind of saying, well, my feelings are over here, my body's over here, and they can contradict one another. And some of the intellectuals, the postmodern intellectuals who write on this, like Judith Butler, she's kind of considered the founder of queer theory. She says this very explicitly, that my body has nothing to do with my sexual identity. And of course, abortion, very obviously, because secular bioethicists agree that life begins at conception in a biological sense. You will not find any secular bioethicist who denies that life begins at conception. The evidence from science, from DNA and genetics, is just too strong to deny it. So what do? They say, well, there's biology, we're biologically human, and then there's personhood. Personhood has to do with your mental abilities, your intellectual capabilities, your self-awareness, your sense of yourself, even your sense of the future is sometimes thrown in there. So again, it's your feelings, your mind against your body, and you're not a person until we decide that you have enough mental development to qualify as a person. So all of these denigrate the body. Well, that means as Christians, we have the opportunity to frame a very positive message, because we can say God created the body, and you are meant to be a coherent, integrated whole. Your mind and feelings are meant to be integrated with who you are biologically, with your body. And it's amazing, because in the past, people always thought it was Christians who had a low view of the physical world, right? The spiritual world is all that matters, and we're going to go to heaven anyway, so who cares about this life? But compared to the secular, materialist, postmodern view, Christians have a much higher view of the body today. So it's one of our selling points. It's one of the reasons Christianity is good news, is because we can approach the secular person now and say, we're offering you a worldview that gives you value and dignity and significance, inside and out, from the body to the mind to the spirit. And it gives us a positive way of saying the Christian ethic depends on honoring your body, respecting your body, living in harmony with your body. I quote one. I'll give you just one quote. One of my favorite quotes is from a woman who lived as a lesbian for many years and then converted to Christianity. And she said, I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason, and I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design.
Mm.
Oh,
I thought
that's
that
good.
captures it, right?
Yes.
Now, if
Oh
we
That's
can
wow.
convey that positive message, that will win the hearts of postmodern young people.
hmm.
Wow. Listen, we really, really appreciate you and the time that you've given us. You've helped me tremendously. I'm sure you've helped Bobby as well.
Yeah.
You know, our minds have been open, and we know those who are watching this podcast, their minds are going to be enlightened as well.
Hey,
Listen,
hey,
tell us, how do we
Anthony.
get your? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, I think I jumped in a little bit too quick. You were about to say it. I just want to encourage all of our listeners and everybody watching us to read, especially these last two books that we've been talking about by Nancy. And I think you were going to say something about that. So,
Yeah, I was going to
yeah.
ask, how do we get the Toxic War on Masculinity?
Well, you can get it at Amazon, like everything else, unless you
Awesome.
prefer places like ChristianBook.com. And I do have a website. My publisher very generously redesigned my website so it's colorful and fun. NancyPeercy.com, and Pearcy is Pearcey. NancyPeercy.com. So you can come over and browse my other books, and you can leave a message. So come on by and say hello.
Awesome.
Awesome. Bobby, I'll give you the final words.
Well, Nancy, thank you so much for the time that you spent with us. Thank you for doing the hard work of pulling this research together and of encouraging us. I mean, the what you're telling us is what Scripture teaches is the best. Like human flourishing is the result of male headship in the home for wives and children, Christ-like male headship. You're telling us that being in tune with the bodies that God made for us, that is for human flourishing. And at the end of the day, that God is good and his teachings are good for us. Thank you for helping us to see that. Thank you for doing the hard work and making those things public. And also, thank you, Nancy, for entering into the public square and trying to advocate for the goodness of God on these issues.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate your encouragement.
God bless you all. And we will look forward to our next session in Scripture in Black and White.
Bobby Harrington from Scripture in Black and White here. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. Hey, can you help us? If you could like, comment, and subscribe to our channel, that would be great. Just subscribe to renew.org, and then you'll get notices when the next episode from our podcast or other Renew podcasts come out. And it would greatly help us, and we hope and believe it will greatly encourage you.